I've got maybe 5 or 6 questions, quiz questions, and the winner gets a bottle of wine. And Bill keeps track. 6 questions. There are 6 questions, so it'll pop up. And
If I could trip you, I would.
there are some clues to the answers to some of the questions in the slides. So the one who pays close attention might get an idea. Well, shall we go ahead and get going? It's 10 after, and I need to get home because I ordered some hearing aids for my stepmom and they're shipping to my house because they were so expensive. You had to be there and sign a little bit. Okay, so I want you to all be impressed by my slide animations. Okay, watch this. Dum.
Very nice.
Yeah, isn't that great? Okay, so we're here to talk about the Bible in English. So in English, obviously, it didn't start out that way. The works that we know that are included in the Christian Bible were composed over a period of maybe 700 to 850 years. And what we Christians refer to as the Old Testament, which would be the scriptures of both the Jewish faith and the first followers of Jesus, were originally written in Hebrew. The first followers of Jesus likely spoke mostly Aramaic, which is a Syriac language. They probably would have been able to understand a little bit of Hebrew when it was read, but that's not what they would have been speaking or hearing. And Bill?
And Aramaic.
And a little bit of the Hebrew Bible is in Aramaic, a few parts of Gabe. Bill pointed that out earlier today. He is correct. That's why he's disqualified from the quiz. What became the New Testament scriptures were generally written between about 50 and 120 Common Era. The 50 date being about the time Paul's letters started to be composed, and 120 might be the latest that scholars date some of the other letters in the New Testament. But the scriptures that the New Testament authors referred to and had available to them were the Jewish scriptures, but in Greek. Okay, what? Well, we just said they were in Hebrew, right? So enter what's called the Septuagint. By the early part of the 3rd century Common Era, the number of Jews outside of Palestine and speaking Greek and no longer speaking Hebrew was enough that they needed a translation of their scriptures in Greek. So along comes the Septuagint, which was created in Alexandria, Egypt. Tradition holds that it was translated by 72 translators, 6 each from the 12 tribes of Israel, who translated it from Hebrew to Greek. Now, tradition holds typically means that's probably not really how it happened, but it sounds good, right? Because it was equal representation from the 12 tribes. I think there's even, if Sheldon were here, he could confirm this, but there was some miraculous account that, you know, the translators acted independently, and when they got together, by gosh, word for word, their translations all lined up. So the Septuagint was the translation that Paul and all of the authors of our New Testament works would have drawn from. So they were not working in the original language that the Hebrew scriptures were written. Okay, ready, Bill? Bible quiz, part 1. The Hebrew Bible includes the books of Samuel and Kings as 2 separate books. Most Christian Bibles, probably all Christian Bibles, if you look in the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, you see 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Okay, why? Why is that?
Did I miss the beginning?
Yes.
Yes.
What time do you start?
But you came in for the quiz. We started 15 minutes ago, for Lord's sake.
Seriously?
Just time for the first
5.
We started 5 minutes ago. We saw how long the line was for quiz, so we paused for the quiz. But you came in just in time for the quiz. Okay, so Bill has written down everybody's name, and now we'll go around. So why? Why does the Hebrew Bible have books of Samuel and Kings, and most Christian Bibles have 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings?
Did you tell them the wine is prize.
The wine is the prize, wine is the prize, the full bottle, not the empty wine.
I'm going to guess that it has something to do with the Septuagint and how they translated it, and so that Samuel and Kings were one narrative in Hebrew and two narratives in.
Okay. Anybody else want to get their name drawn in the pool here?
I didn't learn this in seminary, so it's not cheating, okay? My guess, and it's literally a guess, is that it has something to do with how big a book they could bind.
That's part, you both are partly right.
Okay.
But I want to hear other guesses too, so. And Bill is our judge. This is like NPR's, what's that?
Wait,
Don't tell me. So Bill can award partial credit.
I was thinking about like whether the Septuagint, is it like, without knowing its structure or whatever, whether part of Samuel, part of Kings, like transferred between, whether it be pages or whatever it was, and so there's kind of like a natural kind of break in document, and it's restructured.
Other, Glenn?
More is better. More like, yeah.
More kings, we want another king.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We want that sequel
the
money.
Greeks came up with sequels, right?
Yeah.
They're like Dan Brown. They're
Yeah.
just like, well, okay, anybody else? Come on, Stephen.
The idea of the codex comes much later. At least the Hebrew Bible was on scrolls. And then, since they're all separate scrolls, it's easy to make a guess that one of those scrolls appeared at a later time in another setting, and that's what was picked up.
Okay, so first clue is on the previous slide. There's a clue on this. This is Hebrew. What do you see? What do you notice about the script? Not that you need necessarily need to read Hebrew to know it. It has dots.
It has vowels.
Boom. The difference is vowels.
Yes.
Hebrew omitted vowels. They put the little points in to indicate where the vowels likely would go. And they didn't put any spaces between the words. So when you take out all those vowels, you could practically fit it on one manuscript. When it was translated into Greek, at that time, Greek included vowels, which you can see if you look closely here. There's vowels in there, some theta, etas, and still no space between the words. The words are all crammed together, but simply the practicality of, I mean, think about it. I mean, if you're adding, what, 30, 40% more characters, you know, your manuscript is bigger. So, Bill, who's in the lead?
Well, since nobody actually got it totally right, a half point to everybody who spoke, which is Cynthia, Evan, and Dave. Does anybody else speak?
Stephen.
There's like some Steve, like polite applause.
Okay, let's continue on. So we're heading towards English, but we're not there yet. So the first, aside from Greek, so the first translation from Hebrew into Greek would kind of be the first translation, and the second one is the Latin Vulgate, which is largely a work of a single translator, Jerome, commissioned in 382. This is after things had sort of settled down for Christians within the Roman Empire. The persecutions, about 80 years of the past. 311 was when Constantine legalized Christianity, so it was a lot safer, and by this point, Constantine's successors were demanding some consistency in this religion of the empire. So, got to get Jerome working in Latin. Of course, Latin was the language of the western part of the empire. He probably used some earlier Latin texts, but he did rely on Hebrew and Greek. So we have kind of the first work in a language that went back to original languages. This had been the Western Church's scriptures well into the 20th century. At the earlier presentation, Lou Nagy could remember, as a Roman Catholic, going to Latin Mass. So that made me, this isn't part of the quiz, but does anyone know where the term hocus pocus comes from? Like if you're, I'm going to turn you into a frog.
Hocus corpus.
Hocus corpus.
Yeah. This is
Which
my
is
body.
when the transubstantiation happens. It's when the bells ring, and it's when the transubstantiation happens. So, that's where that, and then, I can't remember the examples that we had, but he had a couple of other kind of funny ones, because he said he was an altar boy, and, they would just snicker in the back of the church and, say what, it sounded like they were saying this, but it was something else.
This is like Dominic, don't frisk us.
Dominic, don't frisk us, that was it, yeah.
So Jerome did not work from the Septuagint, but he worked from the
Yeah,
original.
he would have worked from the original Hebrew and then the Greek New Testament works, yeah.
St. Augustine didn't like Jerome's translation. He knew it was wrong.
Yeah,
But what he read was a really bad Latin version.
yeah. It would have been better had Augustine
Never comfortable.
had Jerome's translation, because he got a really bad translation. And he didn't know Greek. Augustine didn't
Well,
read or know Greek.
He did with a dictionary with difficulty. He hated it because he was beaten for not learning all the
Yeah.
cases and declensions of words when he was a child.
Okay, so now let's finally get to the first Bible in what I call modern English. So I'm going to skip over the translation into Middle English, went from the Latin Vulgate that John Wycliffe did, and jump into English translations that we could all read that go back to the original language. So William Tyndale, sitting there smiling at us, is credited with the first Bible in English to come directly from Hebrew and Greek. It wasn't an entire translation. He wasn't able to finish it, and a guy named Miles Coverdale finished it later. It was from Hebrew and Greek, but he did rely heavily on the Latin Vulgate and Luther's German translation from, would have been probably maybe 20 years earlier or so. He had to leave England to complete his, quote, heretical work, because this is pre-Reformation England, so this is Roman Catholic England, and his translation was condemned by the Catholic authorities of England. And two examples of why it was condemned. One, he boldly translated ecclesia as congregation and not church. And probably the better translation would be gathering. So you would use the term ecclesia for Jews gathering in the synagogue, followers of Jesus gathering in a home, the city council gathering wherever the city council gathered. It didn't have the ecclesiastical baggage that we have with it now. It was just a gathering. So by translating out as church, that was undermining, introducing some of these kind of Protestant ideas from the mainland. He also translated presbyteros to mean elder instead of priest. That probably really got him going, right? So he had to leave England and didn't finish it before he died. But nonetheless, this Tyndale Bible cast a long shadow. It had a lot of influence on subsequent Bibles. In fact, about maybe, let's see, this is a couple bullets I gave myself. It was relied on heavily for the first authorized Bible in English, which was 1539 Great Bible. And as I mentioned with a couple of those translation choices, it included the spread of some Reformation ideas into England, which had been a little bit resistant to that prior. And it had a heavy influence on the 1611 King James Version. Maybe 90% of what's in the King James Version came from the Tyndale Bible.
Like copied word for word?
Or heavy reliance on, if there was a choice to be made in a translation, to go with Tyndale's choice. And more about translation choices to come. But Bible quiz number 2 first. And this will kind of reinforce why there were choices available. So, there's a set number of books that comprise really the universal New Testament canon, whether it's Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Protestant. And there are Greek manuscripts, more than one, I would suggest, that's kind of a clue here, for books of the New Testament. So if we take all the manuscripts that we have for all the books of the New Testament and total them up, how many would that be? And this is multiple choice. Would that be 50? We have 50 manuscripts of the 27 works.
And when you say manuscripts, you mean identical?
A copy.
Identical.
Well, maybe not identical, but
Identical
copies.
is-
Copies.
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 Very hard to get hand copied
Yeah,
things to be identical.
yeah, yeah.
You don't mean different versions then?
No, I mean different, like, here's a manuscript that's the Gospel of Mark, and here's another one, and here's another one, and here's another. How many, if you took all of them for, you know, from Matthew through Revelation, how many are there total? Are there 50, 500, 2,300, 5,800, 6,300? All right, Bill, you ready to, all right, go around.
Definitely go for 50.
50, okay.
I'm gonna go with 6,300.
6,300, okay. Susie?
I'll go for 500.
500, 500,
I'm gonna say 50 also.
50,
5,800.
5,800,
2,300.
2,300, Glenn?
I'm going lowball 50.
5,800.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
One
okay.
right.
This is why there's some, when a committee is putting a revision of, say, the NRSV together, they arm wrestle over which manuscript, because they all have variants, and which is the oldest, which is the most reliable, which has obvious signs of later editing that might have been influenced by some theological, whatever was in vogue theologically at the time. And then part 2 of this quiz question: which book of the New Testament has the least number of manuscripts?
I'm gonna go with John, the Revelation.
Revelation, okay.
Revelation's here.
Genesis.
What did I hear?
Genesis.
Genesis. No, of the New Testament.
First Peter.
1 Peter,
Second Timothy.
I'll say 2 Peter.
2 Peter. All
Good
right.
one, yeah.
Letter to Philemon.
Oh,
But-
wow.
Cut.
But,
I like that.
So short, right?
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Only a
But it would be
page.
easy to copy, right? If you got assigned the copy job, say, I'll take that.
Yeah.
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 No, I'm not going to vote in this.
Okay.
I like Revelation.
Revelation.
Yeah.
Susie? Revelation?
Yeah.
Sure. No? Gail?
Letter to Philemon.
Finally, you said finally.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's Revelation.
Raise your hand, you said Revelation.
Wow. No, Glenn said 2 Peter, we know that. Yeah, nice try.
I said
But just
quiet.
by comparison, so you can see, so the 4 Gospels, there are almost 2,400 manuscripts of the 4 Gospels. So here's this committee sitting down, and they're arguing for one translation of a word over another, and you got to wrestle through, 500 manuscripts of Mark and little variants, right? I mean, does Mark end at verse 8? Or does it have this other, whatever, the appearances? Do the appearances, when do they show up? And actually, there's a woman who was a music teacher, got wild hair about some manuscript thing, and ended up getting a PhD at Duke, and now she's teaching at it's the Catholic school on the West Coast. It starts with a V. Is that Villanova? Yeah, Villanova. And it's about how these manuscript variants have various women entering and disappearing from some of the accounts in the New Testament. And it's really interesting. And it's hard enough that they're all named Mary, or most of them.
Yeah.
And
Okay, so
Craig, what's the time period for these manuscripts?
probably 500 is the earliest manuscripts that we have. 500 Common Era, maybe a little earlier than that. And I don't know how long they go. There might be some earlier than that. I think actually late 4th century or so.
Where do they find them?
Oh, there's this great place called Oxyrhynchus. It's a garbage heap in Alexandria, Egypt. And they're finding stuff there even today. Yeah. In 1945, they found the Gnostic Gospels, which were written in Coptic, but in a jar in a cave, walking distance from 3 monasteries in Egypt. Yeah, well, if you remember a few years ago, 10 years ago maybe, there was this great revelation of the gospel of Jesus' wife. Does anybody remember that story? It was proven to be a hoax because it was in Coptic and it shared a lot in common with the Gospel of Thomas, which is in Coptic, which was a legitimate ancient find. But the line weight exactly matched the version of this Coptic copy of Thomas that was available online, including exactly the same typo in exactly the same place. So, yeah, and then some, people that spend their life figuring out how old a piece of paper is determined it was much, much younger. So. Okay, so let's shift gears to talk about King James Bible, commissioned now by, the Independent Church of England in 1604 and finally released in 1611. King James Bibles around here somewhere. The magisterial language of the King James Bible means it's everywhere in English literature, right? In Shakespeare and poetry of the last few centuries. By the first half of the 18th century, it was unchallenged as the English translation for Anglican and English Protestant churches, used extensively in the United States. And by the beginning of the 19th century, it was the most widely printed book in history. Wow. Okay, it had revisions and updates over the years, and I don't expect you to be able to read this. But the Tyndale, if I can get my cursor to look on the screen up here. Okay, here's Tyndale's translation. Here's Wycliffe off here by himself, right? He doesn't get to join the family tree because he started with Latin. But the going back to the Greek and Hebrew tradition, you can follow Tyndale off to some others, the Great Bible, for example, and then they all kind of influence the King James Bible. And then we follow this down here to the British Revised Bible, the Revised Standard Version, which is what's in the pews in our church here, RSC. I know, we're pretty outdated.
New revised.
No, Revised Standard. No, New Revised is what we read.
That's correct.
What's in the pews, the Bible that's in the little black Bible in the pews, is the RSV. In fact,
At least you have a Bible in the pews,
yeah,
that's cool.
The Bible that Lou picked up from over on the shelf over there, I said, well, it's at least got to be, the 1971 version of it. No, it was from 1952. So it's like, things have moved along since then. But yeah, I mean, you can just see, the proliferation of Bibles in English is amazing, right? But the lineage of the King James to what we're most familiar with as mainline Protestants is, through the Revised Standard Version, and then the New Revised Standard Version, and then the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. We'll talk about all these here.
Craig, what are those 2 little outliers on the bottom?
The Voice is the one right down here. That's right up there. And someone asked about the Message. And I don't see that one on here either. The Jerusalem Bible, you see kind of appearing here out of thin air in the New Jerusalem Bible. That's a translation I like, and especially in the Study Bible version. It's a French, kind of French monastic translation effort, but critically, popularly received. Okay, so the versions that we probably have seen, the King James, so I'm going to follow some kind of Old Testament, who begat who. The King James Version begat the Revised Standard Version, first out in 46, 52, updated in 52 and 71. This is what's in our pews, right? It was, I think that Lou said the version he picked off here was 52, and I looked this morning after giving this presentation the first time. It's the 71 version that's in the little black Bibles in the pews. The New Revised Standard Version came out in 1990, and then the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, NRSVUE, came out in 2021. I don't know, when you keep updating these, what do you're gonna run out of acronyms, right?
Yeah.
The revised new, actually there's a revised New Jerusalem Bible that's available now too. So I don't know, how do you go to the grocery store and everything's new and improved, right? When does something stop being new? The New International Version, that was a kind of partially a reaction to the RSV translation by some evangelical scholars. And I'll talk a little bit about that too. It's the most popular Bible in the U.S. and I mean it's everywhere. I mean, it's just out there. I think it's a pretty accessible translation. So the NRSV, it was published, it was a committee, and many of these are committees, but it was published by the National Council of Churches, which the Episcopal Church is a part of, and an ecumenical committee of scholars, mainline scholars. So these would be people from places like, our Episcopal seminaries, potentially professors, but Harvard, Princeton, University of Chicago, kind of Union Theological Seminary, but preeminent mainline
Virginia.
institutions. Virginia, probably somebody from Virginia. The Bruce Metzger, who was a predominant New Testament Bible scholar, had his hands in, his career lasted long enough, it was both in the RSV and the NRSV, and he was at Princeton. It was intended as a translation to serve, for devotional study, liturgical purposes, and scholarly needs. If you took a New Testament survey class, probably at any public institution in the U.S., you're probably going to be using the NRSV. That's just most commonly used, and what most scholars would refer to if they aren't doing their own translations for their work. The New International Version, a team of 15 scholars from evangelical denominations got together in '67 and produced a New Testament in 1973 and a full Bible in '78, and they went back to original languages. They drew some on the King James Bible, updated in '84 and 2011. There was a gender-inclusive version that was printed and distributed in the UK, but the US publishers refused to put it out. They were concerned about the blowback from it. So you can't make God non-gender or female, for God's sake. The New English Bible and Revised English Bible, these were produced kind of on the same timeline as the NIV, mainly drawing on British and European scholarships. So these are all, I picked kind of the Bibles that you tend. I looked at Amazon, what Bibles are set, what are the most popular translations, and these were the ones that were out there. So the English Standard Version, probably the newest one, and that was again primarily evangelical scholars and pastors creating that translation. Does anybody think of Bibles you see on a shelf somewhere, or you've heard of, or you have yourself that kind of aren't among the ones we've discussed?
I have the Good News Bible.
Yeah, that was, I think, if I remember right, I think the Presbyterian church I grew up in had that in the pew. And I think it's kind of a paraphrase, but I don't know it's trying to be rendered in kind of more
It's more
friendly
everyday. It's really
language.
everyday language.
It is a paraphrase, much like the Message.
Yeah.
It's got footnotes for all the other things that are being cross-referenced to the Old Testament or other concepts.
And that's what I like about this as a study Bible, because it's got some.
How about the Common English Bible, CEV?
Yeah. Did I include that one? No, I didn't. I had it on a slide, and then I realized, wow, our heads are going to be swimming with all these translations. So I can't remember. I'd done some research to figure out what that was, but I've since purged that from my memory. So, do you know what is that?
I don't know its history like this. I just know that it has more gender-inclusive language, and it's not a transliteration. It's not like the Message or the Way, but it tends to be a favorite among progressives who are really trying to avoid the gendered language for God and sort of
Yeah, just more inclusive.
Yeah, exactly.
I know if any of you were doing the study we did during Advent with Angel Levine's book, she likes that too. And anything Angel Levine likes, I like. She's just great. She's either doing her own translations or she was using the CEB.
There's a,
What about the Concordia?
It's Common English Bible. Concordia is, I think, a publishing house, so I don't know. They might publish, a whole bunch of different
Or is it
versions.
my stuff is in storage. It's a big, huge Bible, and you use it for reference.
Oh, the concordance. I'm going to get to
Yeah.
that. Yes,
Oh, okay.
yeah. It weighs about 5 pounds. It's right here on the table. That's why the table's listed.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about some Bible study tools here in just a minute. So, the RSV NIV controversy, what is it? The RSV was the first English Bible to render Isaiah 7:14 as, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a young woman shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Well, that was shocking, right? Because the King James, of course, it was a virgin.
Yeah.
And in the Latin, it was Ecco Virgine, right? Behold the virgin. And then the NRSV updated it to, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel." So, a young woman, but not, the pregnancy is not in the future. She's pregnant now, right? And
From Isaiah.
from Isaiah 7:14, yeah. Yeah, and in the context in Isaiah, it's about, good news for the king who's at war. So both are based on the Hebrew word for young woman found in Isaiah, a word that the Greek Septuagint translated virgin, although there's a different Hebrew word for virgin, not the word that was in the Hebrew Isaiah 7:14 text. So, and I think this is a good point to ask, and the NIV chose to stay with the King James translation. If the scriptures that the authors of the New Testament were using, that their scriptures, remember, were what we call the Old Testament. There was no New Testament, right? And we'll talk a little bit about, how maybe the Gospels were. Some of the Gospel writers might have been aware of other Gospels. And there's no real evidence that they were really aware of any of Paul's letters. But if what they had available as scripture was the Septuagint, shouldn't we be using the Septuagint too, just like they do? We go back to the Hebrew, right? And Luther did that, and then even Jerome did that, but he translated it. Ecce Virgo, or Virgine.
and the funny part too is it's foretold that he will be called Emmanuel, so they named him Jesus.
And they named him Jesus. Yeah, it's like, that's that part. But, okay, so anyway, that was just one element of what led to, the kind of the more conservative evangelicals saying, we're doing our own translation. We're going to get our scholars together. And
So did they in fact go back to the Septuagint?
they chose, so most NIVs will have a footnote that will say, this could, or young woman, a responsible one would have a footnote that would say, or young woman. And actually, a lot of Catholic Bibles will say, this virgin comes from the Septuagint, and they'll say like MT, which is the Masoretic text. The Hebrew says young woman.
So Emmanuel means God with us, right?
Yeah.
Are there any translations, and therefore will be called God with us? I mean,
Oh, you mean, what, yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that a funny thing? I mean, why didn't we translate Christ? Christ simply means anointed. Why doesn't our Bible say Jesus the anointed, or the anointed Jesus? We chose to keep, we kind of transliterate the Greek Christos into English Christ. So, my kids thought, Jesus' mom and dad were Mr. and Mrs. Christ, right?
but if it were translated like every other word were translated, we'll call him God with us. That would jive a little bit more with naming your son Jesus as opposed to
Yeah.
Emmanuel. I mean, why did they not translate?
Well, we gotta remember, so in Matthew's infancy narrative, he's looking for 5 things, because 5's the magic number, 5 books of the Pentateuch, 5 prophecies, 5 dreams, 5, what else is there, Bill? There's 5 of all kinds of stuff. So he's looking for a prophecy, so he's mining the scriptures for this prophecy, and there it was. It didn't matter, I mean, he knew that Jesus was the name, so he didn't bother to say, well, really they called him Emmanuel, and then his nickname was Jesus. Something like that.
Why not the rustic and
Sorry, what?
why not the, like a more, like primitive, rustic society using an
Well, you know, speaking of rustic, I mean, 95% of the people in the first century Common Era were illiterate, right? They couldn't read or write in Aramaic.
hunter-gatherers?
Sorry, what?
Hunter-gatherers.
Hunter-gatherers, well, that was a little bit farther back. But, okay, ready for Bible Quiz 3, Bill? You got your notes ready? Okay. What was the last book that was included in the New Testament canon? The canon is the collection of books that are officially endorsed as authorized to be in the New Testament. What was the last one we got? Revelation. Revelation.
This is a trick question.
Revelation.
Anybody not?
The
No, it's not a trick question. It was Revelation. And it came in the 4th century, right? And it truly was late, and there was lots of debate about whether it should be included or not. And it was used in a variety of different ways, typically to bash your enemies over the head. Right? It was used by Athanasius against the heretics, and it was used by Christians against the Roman emperor, right? The emperor was, a couple of emperors were identified as the whore of Babylon or the beast. And so it even had controversy in its day among people who were trying to decide if it should be in. And it finally got in because they justified it as the same authorship as the Gospel of John. Though if you put the two down next to each other, you'd say, okay, if that's the case, here was John writing in his prime, here was John writing after dementia had set in, and he was quite old, because the quality of the Greek couldn't be more different. It's really, really well written versus really sloppy.
So it's not been fully established that John wrote the Revelation?
Oh, it's pretty, the scholarship's pretty united. The two different authors. The Gospel, according to John, is one author, and the Apocalypse of John is a different John. Yeah. In fact, they think it even, in the work, it identifies John of Patmos, which was an island off in the Mediterranean.
John's Gospel was controversial also. That was,
Yeah.
There was a lot of controversy over whether it should be added to the canon
Yeah.
a lot earlier. It's such a different view.
It's, so I've just been reading an account of the Council of Nicaea and Constantine legalizing Christianity and trying to get the Christians to get a little more organized and unified, which was pretty tough because they were kind of all over the place. There's this guy named Arius, and he had his take on the person of Jesus and how does God relate to the person of Jesus. And Athanasius, the heretic hunter, had quite a different role, and the stuff that they did was just nuts. And actually, I think to Constantine's credit, at one point, he's actually going to these debates where all these bishops are arguing all these points about, was it a like nature to God? Was it the same nature as God? And homoousios is the Greek word that and he's Constantine kind of goes, who cares? This sounds like you're really debating this little minor point. Can't we get past this for the sake of unity? I thought that was a very human moment for Constantine, but it didn't stop the debate, raging on and on and on. Yeah.
or the killing. There was a lot of
Oh,
bloodshed.
armed
Yes.
bands of monks
Yeah.
in the streets beating up the Arians versus the Catholics at the time. Kind of Catholics with a small c. This was really before the Roman Catholic Church. So. Okay, part 2 of the quiz question. What 2 books did the reformer Martin Luther want to remove from the New Testament? And in fact, in his German Bible, he included them in an appendix.
Okay, I know for sure it's Revelation.
Revelation. Okay. Partial credit.
I'm gonna be the other one. I'm
Yeah.
not gonna say.
Okay, you can be last.
I'll be last.
Okay, anyone else?
Maybe the Gospel of John.
John? That's not bad, yes.
Fun.
I'm gonna say yes.
So
I'll find the resolution.
anyone else want to hazard a guess?
It's the Gospel of Trevor, and that's why you've never read it.
Trevor.
He was successful.
Yeah, he was
and removed
successful.
it.
He was successful in Daniel. No, the book of James.
The straw.
And
Of
Revelation.
course, because
Yeah.
The
faith
straw
that works
epistle.
it.
Yeah. So if you remember, what Luther teased out of Romans was justification by grace without works of the law. And of course, James says, faith without works is dead. So Luther thought, no, that's wrong. So he wanted to exclude it. Okay, not a part of the quiz. How many books are there in the Bible? We've established 27 in the New Testament. 52? 66. 39 Old Testament books, and that's counting, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings. That's it. 66 in most Protestant Bibles, 73 in Catholic Bibles, because Roman Catholics include the Apocrypha or the deuterocanonical works in the Old Testament, and then have the same 27 New Testament books. 73, which is 39 Old Testament, 27 New Testament, and then the 7 deuterocanonical books or Apocrypha in Anglican and some Protestant Bibles, like Lutherans. 78 in Orthodox Bibles, 81 in some Oriental Orthodox Bibles, and some with as many as 86.
Are those
So-
other books or just the same ones divided up?
I didn't dig into that. I know about the 66 to 73, but I don't know how, like in Orthodox Bibles, you get from 73 to 78. Bill, I'd hazard a guess that they maybe include like 3rd and 4th Maccabees, where the Apocrypha, I think, just has 1st and 2nd Maccabees. So it may be things like that. I don't think it's further division of works because of historical manuscript limitations. So, as Episcopalians, members of the Anglican Communion, where do you think we fall?
It says 73.
73? But we have RSVs and NRSVs. Some around here have the Apocrypha, some don't. I don't think anybody's paid a lot of attention to that. However, it may interest you to know that our lectionary readings include Sunday lectionary readings from 2 books from the Apocrypha, Ecclesiasticus and Wisdom of Solomon. Okay, let's switch
Which is
gears.
different than the book, than wisdom.
Ecclesiastes.
No, yeah.
Ecclesiasticus, somebody asked that earlier. Isn't that the same as Ecclesiastes? No. Ecclesiasticus and help me say that, please. Those are 2 different works, and the Wisdom of Solomon is a different work, too. Okay, some Bible study tools. Good study Bible that's got good notes and, I think, section headings. And I've got a slide a little bit later to show you what I mean by that. Because, the way our Bibles tend to be written, kind of like a phone book almost. It's like, where does something begin and end? Where is something that's maybe a quote of a hymn or poetry or, some other literary genre? It's buried because it's just, margin to margin dense text. Troublemakers are here.
A good example of that would be the opening of the book of
Yeah.
Because that's a hymn.
Yeah. Or I like, especially when a Bible will set off the four, what do we call them, the canticles in the Lucan infancy narrative, right? The Magnificat, the Nunc Dimittis, which is using the Latin names, but the Song of Mary, the Song of Simeon, so on. It's really helpful, I think, to realize, oh, this is probably part of a hymn, or this is poetry, or this is something different. So having those headings that break up, and that's why these study Bibles end up being, obscenely heavy and really thick. But I think this is all available online, so you don't need to lug your book around. Specialty editions with notes and essays, and the two that I'm going to show you that I really like, the Jewish Annotated New Testament, which is available with NRSV, and they're working on a revision for NRSV updated edition. The Jewish Study Bible, which is produced by the what's the organization? The Jewish Publication Society, and it's a terrific translation with lots of great notes. And if you want to understand the Hebrew Bible, understand how the Jews understand it. A Greek-English interlinear translation, and I've got a picture I'll show you on a subsequent screen. Actually, let me pass some of these around. So that's the, yeah, you see that's what, so this is interlinear, and you can get these in lots of different, but they'll include, you'll see in just a second on the screen, a line-by-line Greek, literal word-by-word translation. Some of them will actually include an English kind of phonetic transliteration of the Greek letters, so you can sound out the word. That's how it would sound if you're reading Greek. And then whatever the translation is, NRSV or some other translation. Gospel parallels, they're available in 3 or 4 column versions. The 4-column version includes the Gospel of John. The 3-column one, which is a little more common, is just the 3 synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, the ones that share a lot of common narrative and rely to some degree on each other. And then a concordance. And this is what you were asking about earlier, is a concordance. This one's a little older. It still works really well. It's keyed to the RSV as well as the King James Bible. It has every word in the Bible in it and where those words appear, and it assigns a number to it if it's in English or Greek, and there's a dictionary in the back, or an English and a Greek and a Hebrew dictionary, and you can look up what that Hebrew word means. There's a number in here, and you can look up love, and then you can look it up and see, okay, what is that Hebrew, what else does that Hebrew word we translate love potentially mean? So it's truly exhaustive, which is why that's in the title of the book there.
Exhaustive.
But it's fun. I mean, you can go down some real rabbit holes when you start looking at, well, where does this word, and then one leads to another, and it's like, oh, why did they use that? Why did they translate it this way here in the New Testament when it meant this in the Old Testament? Okay, so my favorite study Bible is the New Jerusalem Bible, and here's why. Pass this around. I just take a picture of it and put it into here, but so the way it's written out, it breaks up. It has a section heading here. So this is the story of the privilege of the disciples, or the story of the Great Commandment. And if this little story, this little snippet, or pericope, this fancy Latin word for it, is parallel somewhere else in Matthew or Mark or Luke, it'll have 2 little parallel lines here, and it'll tell you where to find this same story in Matthew or Luke. So you go look in Matthew 22 verses 34 to 40, or Mark 12, 28 to 31. it's kind of hard to see, but there's little, I think I can't tell on here if these are the footnotes. What you don't see is about a third of the page, the bottom of the page is footnotes, right? And so like there, that says G, okay? So on this page, we're all ready to footnote G, right? Oh,
Nice
that,
bookmark.
no, I used this when I used to teach high school Sunday school, and I had prizes for the kids got stuff right, paying them to learn, right? Your daughter, for example, Alana. The other thing I like about this is if there's something that is an exact quote from somewhere else in the Bible, they'll show that in italics, and then over here in the side notes, it'll say where that's found. So this, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and notice the italics stop, and your neighbor as yourself. So you can see over here, it's saying, okay, that is Deuteronomy 6:5, and Leviticus 19:18, and Leviticus 18:5. So you can see, oh, that's right out of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint in this case. And with all your mind was something that the author of Luke added to, this quote directly from Deuteronomy and Leviticus. And everyone would know this. I mean, this would be a phrase that, you would start to say it and everybody could finish the rest of the quote, right? Yeah, I just think that the way that Bible is laid out, it's just, it makes, the narrative makes so much more sense than if you're just reading this column to, margin to margin, where does something begin and end? It's got section headings, extensive footnotes, references in the margin, direct quotes in italics. Okay, the two specialty study Bibles that I think are worth a look I passed around is the Jewish Study Bible, which is referred to as the Tanakh, which is an acronym formed by the Hebrew words Torah, Sevi'im, and Ketuvim, which is the law, the prophets, and the writings. Those are how the Jews would define three sections of the Hebrew Bible. And then the Jewish annotated New Testament that I mentioned. This is work of, it was co-chaired by Amy Jo Levine, who I mentioned earlier, and Mark Breitler, who's a Hebrew scholar at Duke University. And just for the essays alone, it's worth the purchase price. They're magnificent. They're not too long, but if you want to learn, like, what were the Pharisees really like, there's about a 3-page account of that, and you realize, oh, well, they kind of get cast as the bad guys, but really they were kind of the progressives of their time. And then here's an example of the Greek interlinear Bible. And Bill, you have an example. There's another version where, in addition to the actual Greek words and the transliteration, this is the translation of that Greek word, this is the translation of that Greek word, there's actually kind of a...
It's the phonetic of the Greek, yeah.
Of the Greek.
So if you don't know the Greek letters, you can see that, like, the second word is arche, which is kind of nice to know because arche is like archaeology, like beginning sort of.
Yeah, so this is the beginning of John's Gospel, and then down here is the NRSV translation. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the transliteration of the Greek that gets us to that is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and God was the Word. Switches the two around.
But just like logos, I mean, Word is not a great translation for logos.
Yeah.
There's so much more too.
I think in some French translations, they don't translate it word, they translate it whatever the French word for verb is. So if you think of verb is an action. In the beginning was the action. Yeah. Okay. And then here's an example of the gospel parallels. And I picked this one, of course, because it's Lent. So in columns, typically starting with the narrative found in Mark's gospel, they'll put the Markan text, And then if there are parallels to that text in Matthew and Luke, they'll line it up, and then the space is added in here to see where things kind of line up between the three. And space is left if there's things that, say, these two evangelists added that weren't found in Mark. And they'll keep the parallel going between here, Luke and Matthew, where they share a lot in common. And this is a great way to understand what's called the four-source theory of the New Testament, of the Gospels. The idea is that Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark, that they were familiar with a copy of Mark, and so a lot of the narrative is pulled from Mark. You see it here. But then they had other sources too, and in some cases, those other sources suggest that one of them was was common to Matthew and Luke. And this German scholarship identified this in the last century. And the German word for source is Quelle, and so they just abbreviate that Q. So this body of gospel narrative that's common to Matthew and Luke, but not found in Mark, they dub Q, the Q source. It's a theoretical source. No one's found this papyrus that's titled Q on the top, right? And then there are elements that are unique to Matthew and Luke that aren't found in Mark, that aren't found in this theoretical Q source, that are kind of just unique Lucan or Matthean or Lucan things. And if you remember from Bill's class a few weeks ago, the parable understanding of the Gospel of Luke was that the Spirit is driving the church and eventually moving it to Rome. That's kind of the narrative through Luke and Acts. And it's the Holy Spirit doing that. So in Luke, you see this a lot, full of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit shows up all over the place in Luke. And you can see Matthew doesn't have it that same way. I mean, he's led by a Spirit, but here it's clearly, comma, full of the Holy Spirit. And here it says, then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness. And Luke still maintained that, but added to that the Holy Spirit. Here's the difference. In Mark, he was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts. But Matthew and Luke both have this tradition that he fasted that whole time. So in Luke, tempted by the devil, had nothing to eat during those days, and when they were over, he was famished. And I wonder, is there a little sense of humor in this? I mean, who wouldn't be famished after 40 days of fasting, right? And he was hungry. But that's clearly probably something that a common source that they had, this Q source. And probably the same thing, this is written, one does not live by bread alone. This version I've got is 4 column 1, so it includes the Gospel of John, Gospel according to John, and there aren't, you'll notice there are a lot of places where there's no parable, because there's speculation about how much John knew of the Synoptic Gospels, but John's on path with the Gospel. In fact, 45% of the Gospel of John is accounting for just the last 2 days of Jesus' earthly life. So some people talk about it as a crucifixion narrative with prelude. Okay, final Bible quiz for all the wine. Bill, you ready? All right. When were chapters and verses added to the scriptures? Okay, multiple choice. Well, when it was first written, of course, right? Any writer knows that. In the 300s Common Era, in the 800s Common Era, in the 1200s, in the 1500s, in the 1800s. There are your choices.
I'll go 800.
But it was for
800s, okay.
We're gonna say when it was first.
Yes.
Okay, 800? 800?
I want to say 1,500.
1,500? Okay.
1,200.
1,200?
So 1800.
1,800s? Gail?
1500.
1,500s? John?
I don't have a guess, thank you.
Okay, did everybody get a guess?
I have two guesses.
I don't know,
300 CE
but I would guess 800s.
800s, okay.
This one had two, she's got another guess.
What'd you say?
What's your guess?
Oh, 300 CE and when it was first written.
300s? Okay. So, major divisions were added in the 1200s,
Wow.
and verses weren't added until the 1500s.
Wow.
And I didn't
Because
bring up an example of it, but
That's what I was
but
thinking.
they were added to the Latin translation. And by that time, for example, in Paul's letter to the Romans, it really messed up some of the rhetorical techniques that Paul used. And remember, he was vocalizing, someone was writing this down. And the chapter and verse really obscures some of that. The best example is the end of chapter 3. The argument that Paul's really making is concluded in chapter 4, verse 3. But anyone reading it would say, well, that's a different chapter. No, that was added, in that case, 1,450 years after Paul was dictating and polishing up this great diatribe that, burdened by chapter and verse. So,
Okay, who said 1500s? Evan?
partial credit for that.
And then who said 1200s? Okay. Anybody say 1500 and 1200 because that's full credit? All right, so
It's a trick question, it implied one answer.
It does.
Yeah, I almost,
it was true question.
yeah, but,
Still a play.
Hmm.
partial credit. Okay, that concludes it. So next week, well, Bill will tally it up here. Next week, Stephen is presenting on St. Augustine, and then we're going to take a break for Easter, and then your second presentation on St. Augustine,
Yeah, we're focusing on confessions.
the Confessions. And then, I can't remember what we have after that. I think Michelle Cornwell may be doing something on some of the English mystics.
There's another book of Moses that's really worth reading, translated by Everett Fox, and it translates as closely as possible to the poetry.
Oh,
So like when Jacob and Esau are meeting, and I faced him to face his face, and the face of him with, it as closely as possible does